Welcome back to the Mentor Roulette grind. This time, we're playing Scholar on a Wednesday evening. And the name of the game in this episode is, remember, at level 50, Art of War is a gain on 1. You'll get what I mean by that soon enough. With that said, for the first duty, we went to Over the Bootstraps, and weirdly, at this low level, Scholar has 2 optimizations to do. The first one is that auto attacks are close to like 50 potency when compared to Ruin. Another is considering whether Bio 1 is worth using at all. It takes 24 seconds for it to overtake Ruin, but then again, Ruin delays your auto attacks by a second, Bio does not, so depending on the timing, it could be closer to 21 seconds. Anyway, typically it just barely works out to Bio 1 being worth using. For duty 2, we went to Porta Decumana, and the first thing I noticed is that the Black Mage seemed to use Freeze instead of Blizzard 1, as in, they were seemingly doing the rotation correctly, but they used Freeze instead of Blizzard 1, with no other mistake. I didn't ask, but my guess is that they just don't have Blizzard 1 on their bars anymore, and couldn't be bothered to change that for a single duty. Overall, it's a relatively small difference, although I have heard recently that Blizzard 1 is part of a decent option for recovery when you mess up as a Black Mage nowadays. On a different note, our Paladin was very good about cycling defensives. For myself, Porta Decumana specifically is one of the more interesting duties as Scholar despite the level range. The first thing to note is that Art of War is a gain on 1. This is because Art of War has no cast time but does the same damage as Ruin 1 at this level. Note that Ruin 2 does 140 potency at this level as well, and it only improves beyond this at level 54 and beyond. Because Art of War does not have a cast time, it does not delay your auto attacks. Ruin 1 having a 1.5 second cast time will delay your auto attacks by 1 second. There's also the part that Art of War being instant like this just frees up movement a lot too. The other thing that makes Scholar interesting here is that if you play carefully with your resources, despite how few you have, you can get away with not casting any healing spells whatsoever, relying solely on Lustrate and Whispering Dawn for the most part. This is done primarily by letting players not be topped up, keep a close eye on how much Lustrate heals for, and as best you can, only use Lustrate if Lustrate's full healing amount can apply. By letting players stay not fully topped up, your pet has plenty of work to do. Another strange detail that comes up as a result of this is that every 3 seconds while in combat, at the same time that MP ticks occur, players recover 1% of their max HP. So having everyone at max HP is, in a weird way, a surprisingly large healing loss. Of course, if anyone starts taking avoidable damage, this plan can fall apart, and Adloquium and Succor may be necessary. And besides, it's not like you need to be this optimal, ever. It is just all in good fun. For duty 3, we went to Ktisis Hyperboreia. This one is surprisingly hard to heal, especially with a Dark Knight tank. Initially, I was wondering if my tank was missing some things, but their gear was good, and they were using TBN and other defensives, although they could use TBN a bit more aggressively on AoE. Later, I figured out that they were trying as hard as they could, and the packs are just strong. Despite the challenge, I managed to use Dissipation close to on cooldown, and get the most out of most of my cooldowns. A particular point in this duty that often can mess up tanks or entire groups is this final pack, which is just 2 mobs. It is pretty common to switch to full-on single target for only 2 mobs, but most jobs these days have incidental AoE, and there is a very high chance at least one person in your party has AoE that is a gain on 2. There are 2 different ways a tank can deal with this issue of wanting to single target while maintaining enmity on both enemies. The first one, simply put, is to switch targets between GCDs, so you alternate what you're attacking. If anyone in your group is doing more damage with AoE on 2 targets, this is more effective to maximize the group's damage, as those players simply lose some damage output when one of the mobs die. The second one is to use Provoke on one of the mobs and attack the other. Provoke, since Shadowbringers, sets you to match the highest enmity on the enemy, and then generates a huge amount of enmity on top. Often, this is enough that you can hold that mob's attention until you eventually switch to it naturally. This strategy is better if your team is having trouble with the damage from the mobs and one of them has to go, as this enables everyone to focus fire one mob while the tank still holds the other's attention. The quote-unquote secret third way in this particular group is that Unleash Stalwart Soul is a gain on 2 for Dark Knights until level 94. So our Dark Knight here could have just spammed AoE. On the final boss, I have one tip that is almost certainly obvious for most, but just in case. True Bravery is a spell he casts once or twice throughout the fight. Among all of his casts, True Bravery is interruptible, which is indicated by the cast bar blinking and flashing. If you ignore it, the result is that the following Trismegistus and about 2 auto attacks will get a damage boost. Obviously, the Trismegistus is the bigger danger here. Now, to interrupt True Bravery, a ranged physical job can use Head Grace, if you have one of those. Or a tank can use Interject. There are so few interruptible things in this entire dungeon that anyone capable might as well just do it. And since a tank is usually always present, this should always be interrupted. Anyway, our tank here interrupted it the second time, so maybe they wanted to know what happened if you let it go through, or they just didn't see it in time the first time. Overall, a decent and interesting dungeon run. For duty 4, we went to Tam-tara Deepcroft, and at first, due to how our tank was a bit slow to get going, I was very worried as they pulled very big. They also used Rampart like a second or two later than I would have liked initially, so I was expecting this to be a tough one. However, after this initial pull, they did much better for the rest of the duty. Not to mention, our tank had brought potions and were actively using them regularly to help with healing. I don't recommend doing these kinds of pulls with random players if you aren't super sure. However, if it works, it works. And if you want to go even further beyond, for the first and second bosses, there is technically nothing preventing you from pulling the blob of mobs up to the boss room. There are just like 3 or 4 extra mobs in the fight as a result. I also recommend before pulling like this that you check what your healer and your DPS are. A Sage, specifically, can't do much while pulling, and once you reach the destination, the damage intake might make Cardiac unhelpful when the Sage has to spam Diagnosis. The 3 other healers at least have dots they can apply to each mob as they run. White Mage is, aside from this dot, in a similar boat to Sage. Scholar's dot is kinda bad in Tam-tara, and their pet can fall behind, although this is typically a minor issue as long as the tank is running fast so they don't get hit. However, Astrologian is insane in this level range. Essential Dignity, check. 500 Potency dot, check. Lightspeed to spam Malefic if they finish dotting everything, check. Anyway, my point is that in this level range, how possible it is to pull this big can be greatly affected by which healer you have. A good player can probably make it work with any healer, but a worse player as an Astrologian probably can too. The duty went along very quickly as a result, of course. For duty 5, we went back to Ktisis Hyperboreia with a Dark Knight tank again. Strange coincidence? Or is it? I recall when I was leveling my jobs to 100, Ktisis and Aegir Scope were exceptionally common, even when getting to like level 93. That was with limited leveling on, of course, which meant full pre-made, and this is not that. Still weird. Now, this tank is my evidence that the previous tank was trying very hard. Just to start, you know something's up when someone goes right round the staircase at the start. I'm just kidding, but isn't it funny how uncommon that is? That aside, it felt like the tank's defensive capabilities slowly deteriorated over the course of the dungeon. First pull, we see Rampart and 1 TBN. Nothing else. Second pull, Shadow Wall, 1 TBN, and then I would say 5 seconds or more later than it should have been, Living Dead. First boss, there was a time where the boss did a tank buster, the tank did nothing, got slapped, then used Edge of Shadow, and then, as the boss was leaving anyways, went, "Oh, I should use Shadow Wall." Then, after the first boss, the tank seemingly completely forgot about TBN and stopped using it entirely. And me asking them to use it more, of course, didn't help either. On the second pull after the first boss, there was even this point where the tank just decided that we should fight the mobs near the staircase, but otherwise didn't really do anything with that. After the second boss, it got even worse when the tank just decided they no longer needed defensive cooldowns altogether. On the first pull here, I intentionally slacked some on healing to see what it would take to get the tank to start doing something. And well, they win the chicken game because I changed my mind by 40%. They just let themselves slowly wither out. On the final poll before the boss, the one I talked about earlier, it seemed the tank did maybe 1 or 2 AoE attacks and then just fully single-targeted one of them, and refused to do anything when the other went on a rampage on me and the Reaper. By comparison to the last run, this was a disaster. The only saving grace was that both of the DPS were pretty good, and the Dancer interrupted from what I could tell. For duty 6, we went to Castrum Meridianum, and, well, it seemed like the Bard was frequently absent. Maybe they started cooking and were expecting Praetorium. Oh well. As is tradition, if Scholar was a Pokemon, I could both imagine it as a pure fairy type, or even like a grass fairy type. That said, designing a Pokemon around a certain type of role can be tough. DPS jobs typically just become various kinds of physical, spatial, or mixed sweepers of some sort. Tanks can often become something more niche or just bulky setuppers and whatnot. They could even be physical walls. Healers though, if it is meant for one-on-one battles, your real proper support moves include Wish, Aromatherapy, setup with Baton Pass or using options like Teleport to take a hit to make an opening, and maybe entry hazards. I guess healers could also turn into special walls, but then again, a Dark Knight could qualify as that too. It makes it pretty hard to envision a healer as a Pokemon, but I could imagine Scholar with Aromatherapy and or Wish at the very least. Anyway, the duty went as expected. Quick and easy. For duty 7, we went to Sastasha Hard, which is an amazingly hilarious dungeon for a job like Scholar. Several points with a bunch of mobs and long hallways to just Art of War as you go. On the first boss, our Black Mage dies right at the end due to me being a bit greedy. The boss frequently puts out dots on everyone, and, well, if everyone's fine, you can probably ignore it. The dots do deal a large amount of damage though, so it may be worth using Ishuna. Now, the real problem is that the boss can use Twister, which pretty much sets the player to near death, and if a dot is still ticking, they pretty much just die. The way a Scholar can work around this is either make sure the player does not have any dots on them, or use Adloquium so the barrier can take a tick while you fix it. Holding Lustrate to insta-heal after the fact can also sometimes work depending on how the dot tick timer aligns. After the first boss, it is worth mentioning these drowned wenches. As long as they're alive, the brines will repeatedly spawn. If they reach her, I believe she gets healed? If you smack the brines, they instead pop for party-wide damage. Maximum speed is to just AoE everything and hope it works out. Maximum safety is to single target the wench and then AoE the rest. But if you ever wondered why you're taking so much damage here, that is why. On the final boss, there's a wacky safe spot right here where I'm standing. Normally, I might announce this so the team knows, but as I am a Scholar, I can simply plant my pet out in the center of the room to heal anyone who doesn't join me in the safe spot, and let them figure it out on their own if they want to. Eventually, the Dark Knight joins me here. In a huge arena like this one, Scholar being able to send their pet around is so insanely powerful. For duty 8, we went to Ninja with a square shield. It looked like the pugilist was trying to weave meditations between their GCDs. Just to be clear, it doesn't work that way. I'm sure they will learn this soon enough. The reason it doesn't work, of course, is because meditation activates your GCD. Also, imagine how insane monk gameplay would be if you could weave meditation. Every GCD you weave meditation or the forbidden chakra. Like, at that point, I could almost see logic in macroing your GCDs to all call for meditation afterwards. For duty 9, we went to Keeper of the Lake, and it's been a bit, but Scholar can solo this dungeon synced. I'm sure tank like Warrior can too if you get smart about it, but as none of the bosses have any sort of DPS checks, as long as they can't outright one-shot the Scholar, they can always recover again and again. An interesting detail about the second part of the dungeon, after the first boss, is that a large part of it can be done in one big pull if you work together. Make sure to let the Colossi out and then continue onward, and you can do both and then open the gate. A neat, weird trick about the second boss is that, as this is a level 50 duty, if you have a Scholar as your healer, there can be a reason to simply single target the boss and just let the Scholar do the AoE damage. Sort of the same logic as maintaining 2 mobs while you single target, so make sure the rest of the team keeps up the damage. A Scholar at level 50 does maximum single target DPS with their AoE button mostly, so letting them deal with the AoE is pretty much free. Not that you really need to optimize this fight that much. In fact, the mobs that may be helpful to clear only take a few hits anyway. And finally for duty 10, I was a 1-minute replacement in Syrcus Tower, of course. Yet another duty where Art of War is a gain on 1. Weirdly, throughout the duty, Alliance A never got a second healer again. They just were stuck with 1 for the entire duty for some reason. Whether that reason was the person that needed to click the button for getting replacements didn't, or there were no healers, who knows. For a moment, I was getting a bit worried that Glacia Labolas was going to actually do something, considering how long it took us to take him down specifically. Some of you might be wondering why that matters, but the simple reason is that both him and the first boss, Skylar, have mechanics that require you to do something specific, similar to Phlegethon and Labyrinth of the Ancients with the Ancient Flare. However, those mechanics usually simply don't happen before the fight is over, which means that should they actually come up, it usually leads to an instantaneous wipe. Now, that was a rather 50s set of Mentor Roulettes this time around. Just to clarify before anyone gets the wrong idea, I swap the positions of Ruin and Art of War when I get a duty where Art of War is a gain on 1. I don't normally play with that specific setup. With that said, this was one set of Mentor Roulettes with every non-limited combat job in Dawntrail. That took a while. At this point, we are at 440 Mentor Roulettes cleared, so still not even a fourth of the way. I wonder what would be more interesting, trying to target more interesting duties, like actively seeking out times where people seem more likely to run extremes and whatnot, or targeting a lot of duties, and so targeting times where people do things like guild hests and other fast duties. From my observations throughout all this, I've noticed as Dawntrail has progressed that initially, tanks and healers got more variety since people were queuing for a ton of Dawntrail content. With time, this has gone down drastically, and healers tend to get a lot of A Realm Reborn content especially. Tanks get slightly more variety, but still mainly more mundane content. DPS gets the most absurd duty swings, as they get both more guild hests than tanks and healers, but also get more extremes than tanks and healers. At least the times where I queue. Maybe I'll try to queue more in the middle of the day again to see how things changed there. But so far, to me, it seems DPS have the by far largest range of clear times on average, since it can be as little as Under the Armor and as big as a failed Sephiroth extreme. Tanks and healers can of course also get anything, but they are far more likely to just get a leveling dungeon that takes at most like 15 to 18 minutes. What do you think would be more interesting? Trying to target extremes, or see how ridiculous things could get if I actively tried to get speedy duties? Let me know! Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, before Shadowbringers, scholars maintained 2 dots with different durations in Miasma and Bio 2. In addition to Energy Drain, they also had Bane as an offensive Etherflow spender, which spread a weaker version of their dots to nearby targets from an origin target, similar to how scholars use deployment tactics in PvP now. They also had Miasma 2 as an AoE attack with a much shorter dot attached to it.